So it's time to start. And the first session sort of really highlights man versus, or human versus microbe. It's a sort of a war. And we have our intelligence officer, Ian Barr, who's going to give us an update on what the enemy's been up to in the last 12 months, particularly influenza. I think everyone will know Ian from the WHO Collaborating Centre, and he's been updating us on what the microbe's been doing for many years. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, great. All right, so I've just got a green button, so it should all be foolproof. Thanks, Lou, and thanks everybody for turning up tonight. And I'd like to thank the organisers for A, not clashing with the Australian Open for the first time in about 20 years, and B, putting influenza back in its rightful place, number one, at the start of this meeting, and none of those new guys, those COVID guys, to take our thunder. So I'm just going to quickly go through to remind you what happened in 2022. It was a long time ago when influenza actually circulated, and I was told I've only got 15 minutes. I thought I had 20, so things might get a bit crazy. So the news are always wanting to know about influenza, and ABC is always on the job as well. So we always hear about flu seasons and what's happening very early on in the piece. And they got it right again, that influenza cases are surging. And this is back in May and June. So this is my normal quiz for those who haven't been here before. I want to know what you thought about the season. So who thought it was a normal season in 2022? Hands up, come on. One brave soul, okay. A low season. Another brave soul. Western Australia shouldn't be in a separate room, David. Medium season. Well, that's getting a bit of curry here. Right, a big season. Okay, all right. Well, it's a bit of a toss-up here. A massive season. No, there's one little hand going up there, but it retracted very quickly. So yeah, look, I think it was probably somewhere between a medium and a big season, or my talk is a moderate season. Definitely more than a low season. And certainly nothing like we've seen in 2020 and 2021. So this is some of the data which you would have seen if you read the Australian Influenza Surveillance Report. And the first graph on the left there is the aspirin data there. And the coloured red graph there is the 2022 season. So this is the influenza-like illness, and now that's getting very confused with other respiratory viruses. But aspirin do their best to try and weed out cases more likely to be influenza-related. And it looks like they've done a pretty good job there. When you compare it to the other ways of measuring influenza, which I'll show you in a minute. But of note is that it was a relatively early season. We also saw an early season in 2019, and that is reflected here in this graph as well. Normally, we wouldn't start to see the season picking up until May or June, usually. And flu tracking had a similar sort of thing with a strange little dip in the middle. So this is one of the more reliable measures we have for following influenza throughout the season, and this is the NNDSS lab-confirmed influenza cases here. So you can see here there's a very steep rise here at the end of May, beginning of June, and things took off, end of April, beginning of May, should I say, took off very quickly and then reduced very quickly as well. And you can see where the down part on that curve is in the red. Normally coincides with the peak of influenza, which is usually in August, most years. You'll be glad to know, for those of you who haven't caught up with it, the NNDS is back. Woohoo! It's been absent for, yes, Kim loves it. It's been absent for 2 years. I don't know what they were doing for 2 years, but they've seemed to have come back, and the only thing I can see difference is that it's got a Power BI front piece as a type of dashboard. But all the data is pretty much the same. They've got things in a little box here, which is now grouping respiratory viruses, RSVs in there, and I assume COVID will get in there sometime or another. So have a play with that, and Kim will no doubt be on it straight after dinner. So looking at what happened around the states, sometimes there's quite variable seasons. Western Australia are usually behind in not only the season and many other things, but this year everything pretty much lined up. Fluke. Yeah, so pretty much the same pattern seen throughout Australia. We are seeing a bit of an uptick in influenza B in Darwin and Northern Territory at the moment, so it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. In terms of types and subtypes, you can see there in the funny little pies there that we had mainly a H3 season. New South Wales were a bit different as well, so they had quite a bit of H1, about a third of the cases were H1 viruses there. And I make the plea every year for labs, if you've got some spare cash, do some subtyping, please. Because this is our data here, and if I put your data up, it will be embarrassing in terms of the amount of subtype which is done in the labs in Australia. So this is a little complicated graph here, but this is one where we represent the diversity of influenza as it circulates. So these sort of balloony type diagrams here, you can see that things were going on early, well early in 2019, sorry. We have these coloured parts here, and the diversity is related to the colours there. This is based on the hemagglutinin gene of influenza, which gives us a pretty good idea of different types of influenza which are circulating. So you can see there in the H1 pandemic virus there that in 2019 we had 4 or 5 different types of influenza that we can detect based on the hemagglutinin gene. And then there was a period there where things really shrunk down or hit a bottleneck, and really only a couple of those clades survived. Similarly with the H3N2, and you can see there, especially with the H3N2, it's back, and you can see that bubble coming back up. And similarly for B Victoria, a couple of clades surviving the big bottleneck. And interesting, the B Yamagata still hasn't come back. Looks like we've killed B Yamagata viruses, so that's one good outcome from the pandemic. So here's just the numbers game here. This is again NDSS numbers. And so you can see here this the number of deaths was certainly up on 2020 and 2021. Some 309 cases, 308, sorry, deaths over that period of time. So I think, you know, it's not as big as some of the years, 2019, 2017, where we had a higher number of deaths. So it was an interesting year for other respiratory viruses as well. And I don't want to get into this too much, but just to show you a few examples. So we all know COVID had a big rise and fall throughout the year. And interestingly, influenza, this is the New South Wales data, I should add, very nice data that they produced for us. One of the few state-based labs that actually gives us data on a number of respiratory viruses. So you can see there that as COVID went down mid-year, influenza went up. On the right-hand side of that graph is some of the other respiratory viruses which New South Wales report on. And you can see there that there was big increases shown in the green for 2022 for both RSV, adenovirus, and human metapneumovirus, all showing quite high levels. And human metapneumovirus continuing on outside the normal winter season. So I think just a reflection on some of the vaccination data there. So there was a lot of vaccine around, 16.8 million doses. Not quite as much vaccine as was swashed around in 2021. So over 20 million doses available for distribution, which have been released by the TGA. And by the air record, some 11 million people vaccines were administered, which sounds pretty good. So that's 43.4% of the eligible population. But still, we were only using 2/3 of the vaccine which was available, if the air database is correct. And that's a bit better than 2021. But I think the rollout of the vaccine was relatively slow, and many people were vaccinated after the peak of influenza, unfortunately. So these are the vaccines which are be available in this year, so really no change there. I don't know whether we're going to have high dose quadrivalent. Maybe somebody from Sanofi can say yes or no. Yes, thank goodness, it's back. And the other vaccines, and we're still waiting for a range of other vaccines which might give us some advantage in the subsections of the market, such as the children with LAIV. So just looking there at a bit of a breakdown of some of the data there, you can see that little graph on the right-hand side shows the 5th of June, or approximately the 5th of June. And you can see there that the peak showed us we really only had about a third of people vaccinated by that period of time. Very small numbers of the under 5s. The over 65s are always doing well. They're always first in the door at the GPs, and pretty ordinary effort from the 5 to 64-year-olds. And most of the vaccine given by GPs, which is not unexpected. What was unexpected was the states giving out free vaccines. So all the states except for Northern Territory and ACT had a free vaccination period for June and July. This is a picture taken in one of my local shopping centres. They've even got signs out in the car park to try and get you in. So having a look at how that went overall. So this is data up until the second week of October, where most of the vaccines should have been given there. So we got up to our 42% by the October period. Did quite a bit of an improvement in the under 5s, up to 36%. Somewhat improved in the 5 to 64, and the 65-year-olds are still going very well. So overall, by the time December came around, we'd got from 42 to 43.4, so that was the final figure. And again, most vaccines are given by GPs, although an increased number of vaccines, not surprisingly, were given by pharmacies. So here's what it looks like for 2023. We've had one change in the recommendation for the influenza vaccine for the Southern Hemisphere and for Australia and New Zealand, and that's to the H1 component there. So the rest of the components are as they were. That's another virus from our lab. So 3 out of the 4 viruses in the current vaccine came from our lab, or in 2023, should I say. Okay, so just a quick flash through the Northern Hemisphere, what's happening there. This is just a diagram from WHO showing the status of influenza as of the 20th of January there. So the darker the yellow, the more intense the influenza. And the little circles there show the influenza A and influenza B. So the bluish colours are influenza A and the brownish colours are influenza B. So you can see it's again mainly H3, although there is some other viruses circulating, some H1s here and there as well. And a lot of viruses are not typed. B viruses are getting a bit of a run in Malaysia, but not really many other places. So this just shows you how the season compares to previous season here. So the far right is the current season, and you can see there the 2021 season with this funny dip and this biphasic type response, and then really nothing in 2021. So the peak is short and sharp, so a little bit unusual if you compare back to 2019 on the far left, whereas a much broader response there. And most of the influenza has been H3. So just looking quickly at the US. So again, this is a heat map here showing the different states there. So most are in green or orange or yellow. So things have calmed down there considerably. The bottom curve there shows that it's mostly influenza A, mostly influenza A H3. They're still doing influenza-like illness there on the top right-hand corner there. You can see there that the plot there for 2022 shown in some sort of starry pattern there is dropping below their magical figure of, I think it's 2.5% ILI cases reported. And the other criteria which they use to assess the severity of the season is the cases of pediatric deaths. So that's children below the age of 18. You can see there's 91 deaths there this current year, and that's considerably higher than the previous year, 45, and the year before there was only 1, and a normal season of well over 100 cases. What's happening in Europe? So I think things are somewhat similar to the US there. You can see there in the bluey colour there, that's their epidemic curve there, and that's gone up and coming down. Most countries in Europe are either low activity or no activity. And they're seeing mainly H3, but there are a few H1 countries there as well. So that's the human story. I just want to touch and finish on what's happening in the avian world. And those of you who have been following the odd newspaper story is that the H5N1 highly pathogenic avian influenza is still circulating very widely, mainly in the Northern Hemisphere, but it's also crept into the Southern Hemisphere, into South America. And this is having a devastating effect not only in poultry, but also in the wildlife. So there's many reports of deaths, large numbers of deaths in wildlife, such as pelicans and other species. So the thing which has happened recently is a couple of things, and one is there was an outbreak in a mink farm in Spain, and that seems to have traits of transmission from mink to mink. We're not quite sure whether that's true or not at this point, whether they might have been fed infected chickens is another possibility, but that's a concerning occurrence with the H5N1. There was also a recent report in the Caspian Sea of 700 seals dying from highly pathogenic avian influenza. So these are concerns, having more and more mammalian species infected and potentially transmitting these viruses, which we haven't seen in the past. So finally, I want to give a plug here. Not only is influenza back, the AIS is back. So we're having a meeting on the 2nd and 3rd of November. You're all invited. We're at the Doherty Auditorium. We'll have all sorts of sessions, mainly influenza, but also sessions on COVID and RSV. And there's plenty of opportunity for people to present their own work. We'll also have some international speakers, and most importantly, it's free. So in summary, I think, influenza is back, and I think 2022 was a moderate to severe season. I think started early, as we've already said. There's a high number of confirmed cases. Some of these may have been due to increased testing due to COVID-19. Influenza H3 was predominant, a bit of H1, a bit of B. The Yamagata virus looks like it's gone, or we hope it's gone. There's no significant resistance against the antiviral drugs. The vaccine match, we're not quite entirely sure how it performed in terms of vaccine efficacy. Alan Cheng might have some comment on the VEs from hospitalisation. So moderate number of deaths on the NDSS. And, I think a number of other respiratory viruses have co-circulated, which is not unusual, but they all seem to have a bit of a leap year this year. So the Northern Hemisphere activity is probably over at the moment, so that's good. And we've had one change in the vaccine. I think one thing which you might want to discuss is the likely issues again with the vaccine rollout. It's pretty likely, I think, that COVID-19 vaccine will also be rolled out at a similar period of time. So there's always that problem for confusion. And my prediction is a moderate year for next year as well, or for this year, sorry. Okay, there's acknowledgements, and I'm a minute over, so apologies.
Ian Masterville will wait. Questions?
You were saying about supplying subtype data. I mean, all public health and most laboratories are generating it. The real issue is the time to put it together. One thing might be just to send us all a note with how you would like the data. And if you want those data in certain, if you just want numbers or whatever, and that would be, the simpler the better, but everybody's generating.
Yeah, they are, but it's variable amounts. I could put up the graph if you like, but they vary quite a bit from state to state. Some states are doing very little, or reporting very little subtyping.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. It's all being generated.
Right.
But if you want us to tell you what subtype,
okay, well, that would be good.
Subtype is, that's fine.
Yeah, no, we'll send around an email if that's the case. I just assume this was being reported through NEDSS, but if it's not, thanks.
Yes.
In the last season in Australia was early, and that influenced whether we got in first with the vaccines or not. The data you just showed suggested that it was equally early in the Northern Hemisphere in both Europe and the USA. Do you think the epidemiology is changing and that we need to go back and rethink when we should be vaccinating in Australia? Because we used to vaccinate early, and then people thought that was a problem, that immunity was waning, and it was moved back. Maybe we should be thinking about moving it forward again.
Yeah, look, I think it's a watch this space, Alan. You're right. Flu is unpredictable. We saw an early season 2019 pre-COVID. So it can happen. We know it's happened in the past. On average, you would expect it to more coincide with winter than autumn. But, who knows? I think we just have to wait until the whole COVID thing washes out and these viruses establish themselves again, hopefully with some sort of regularity, so we can plan appropriate vaccination methods.
Well,
thanks, Ian. I noted the comment about no resistance to Zofluza. I mean, I had absolutely no capacity to find that anywhere in Australia last year.
It's not being marketed.
Well, not even available through wholesalers. I don't know if there's a Roche person here, but I'd be interested if they're actually going to give us any this year.
Anybody from Roche? My understanding is it's not going to be made available this year, but I could be wrong.
Any comments from the table?
Alan might have one.
Alan?
So VE against hospitalisation, almost bang on 50%. So that's sort of moderate for or typical for flu vaccines. Just thinking through there's no Yamagata for another year, despite everything happening in China. Sort of thinking through what we would need for a 2H3 vaccine. There's all the regulatory side, but from strain selection and the thinking at WHO, where are they with that, and what would be an expected timeline?
We at the centre are very proactive in that area. So Cantor is pushing that pretty strongly. So we're putting together a proposal. So we'll be coming to you to run a clinical trial, hopefully next year or maybe at the end of this year. But, I think having 2H3s in the vaccine, it sounds attractive, but the devil is in the detail. And, it all sounds great. You put 2 in, you'll get double the response and you'll get a broader response. That may not be true. And that's what we need to establish in a clinical trial. So I think we're hopeful we can do that. We just need a few $100,000 to do it.
In the drop in flu and then the emergence of the other respiratory viruses, was it cause and effect, or is it just the way of reporting and testing and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated picture, Lou. I think, I can make a pretty strong case for some level of respiratory interference. Whether it could be that strong or not, I doubt. And that period sort of coincided with some schools going back to homeschooling, more mask wearing, blah, 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 blah. So I think there's some social effects in there, but, I think we already know that there is an effect of viral interference, just how big it is. And I doubt whether it could do that sort of thing by itself. But these are very unusual times.
Yes. Last question, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So we've seen RSV going up. We're all assuming we're going to have some vaccines for that. So the first question, is it up just because we're testing more, because we're testing for viral? And secondly, if Novak Djokovic comes back for the 11th time, should we refuse his entry if he hasn't been vaccinated with flu and if he hasn't been vaccinated for RSV?
I'm not a great Novak fan, but he's so good. I think we should ban him. It's the only way he can. He won't win. He's the 11th Australian Open. Look, I think there is an element of all of these respiratory viruses about increasing testing, and I think in at least in the eastern states, there was requests from the chief health officer to do multiplex testing for respiratory virus, which I think is great, and I hope it continues this year. Give us a better idea of what's going on there. And now RSV is a reportable lab confirmed disease. That should help as well. So we'll get much better figures on that sort of incidence. So I wish everybody continue with their multiplex, please. I'm getting things from the back. Better go.
Ian, thank you. Terrific as always. Our